The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Passengers hurried through the corridors with their rolling suitcases, coffee cups in hand, and phones pressed to their ears. Among them walked Marcus Thompson, a tall, well-built black man in his early 40s. He wore a simple navy blue hoodie, faded jeans, and comfortable sneakers. His appearance was casual, almost deliberately understated, as he made his way toward Gate B12. Marcus had learned long ago that traveling in expensive suits only drew unwanted attention and assumptions. Today, he preferred to blend in with the crowd, just another passenger heading to his destination. He carried a worn leather backpack over one shoulder and pulled a modest black suitcase behind him. To anyone watching, he looked like a regular traveler, perhaps a teacher or office worker heading home after a business trip. At the same gate, Victoria Ashford adjusted her designer handbag and checked her reflection in her phone camera. She was a woman in her mid-30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and immaculate makeup. Her outfit screamed expensive, a cream-colored blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, matching designer shoes and jewelry that caught the light with every movement. Victoria worked as a senior marketing executive for a luxury cosmetics company, and she made sure everyone around her knew it. She had built her entire identity around appearances and status symbols. Her social media was filled with photos from expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, and designer shopping sprees. Victoria believed that success was measured by what you owned and how others perceived you. She had little patience for people she considered beneath her social status, and she wasn't shy about expressing those opinions. As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, Victoria noticed she would be sitting in first class, just as she always did. She never flew anything less than business class, considering it beneath her dignity. The thought of sitting among common people in economy made her shudder. She pulled out her phone to take a selfie, making sure to capture her first-class boarding pass in the frame. Marcus approached the gate area and took a seat in the waiting area. He pulled out a simple paperback book and began reading quietly. He had always been an avid reader, finding solace in stories and knowledge. Despite his wealth and success, Marcus maintained simple pleasures and never forgot where he came from. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, he had learned the value of hard work and treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background or appearance. Victoria glanced around the waiting area and noticed Marcus sitting nearby. Her eyes immediately made assumptions based on his casual clothing and modest demeanor. She whispered to her friend Sarah, who was traveling with her, "Look at that guy over there. I hope he's not sitting anywhere near us. These budget travelers always seem to end up making noise or bringing smelly food on board." Sarah, who was more reasonable than Victoria, looked uncomfortable with the comment. "Victoria, you don't even know anything about him. He's just sitting there reading quietly." "Trust me, I know his type," Victoria replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Probably never even been in first class before. I just hope security is keeping an eye on people like that." Marcus couldn't help but overhear parts of their conversation, though he continued reading his book without reacting. He had encountered this type of prejudice countless times throughout his life, especially when he traveled without the obvious trappings of wealth. Over the years, he had developed thick skin and learned to choose his battles carefully. Today, he simply wanted to get home to his family without any drama. The boarding process began with first-class passengers being called forward. Victoria stood up immediately, smoothing her blazer and grabbing her expensive carry-on bag. She walked toward the gate with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around her. Marcus also stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder and joining the first-class boarding line. Victoria noticed Marcus getting in line behind her and turned around with an incredulous expression. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "I think you might be confused. This is the first-class boarding line. Economy passengers board later." Marcus looked at her calmly and replied, "I have a first-class ticket, ma'am." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, taking in his casual clothing and modest appearance. "Are you sure about that? Maybe you should double-check your ticket. First-class seats are quite expensive and, well—" She paused, letting her implication hang in the air. Not everyone can afford them. Other passengers in line began to notice the commotion. Some looked uncomfortable with Victoria's obvious prejudice, while others seemed curious about what would happen next. Marcus remained calm, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. He had been in situations like this before and knew that reacting with anger would only make things worse. "Here's my boarding pass," Marcus said quietly, showing her. The first-class designation clearly printed on the ticket. Victoria studied the boarding pass with suspicion, as if she expected it to be fake. "Well, that's surprising," she muttered, but her tone suggested she still didn't believe he belonged in first class. "I suppose anyone can buy a ticket these days." Marcus simply nodded and remained silent, choosing not to engage further with her hostility. He had learned that sometimes the best response was no response at all. The gate agent began checking boarding passes, and the line started moving forward. As they approached the aircraft, Victoria continued to make subtle comments about the changing quality of first-class passengers and how airlines were letting just anyone into premium cabins these days. Her friend Sarah grew increasingly embarrassed by Victoria's behavior and tried to change the subject several times. Marcus boarded the plane and found his seat in the second row of first class. He stored his backpack in the overhead compartment and settled in with his book, hoping for a peaceful flight. He had an important meeting the next morning and wanted to arrive well-rested. Victoria discovered that her seat was directly across the aisle from Marcus. She made no effort to hide her displeasure at this arrangement, sighing dramatically as she stored her designer luggage and settled into her seat. She immediately pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, likely complaining about her situation to her social media followers. The flight attendants began their pre-flight service, and Marcus politely accepted a glass of water while continuing to read his book. He appeared completely comfortable in the first-class environment, which only seemed to irritate Victoria more. She had expected him to seem out of place or overwhelmed by the luxury, but he acted as if he belonged there naturally. As the plane prepared for takeoff, neither Marcus nor Victoria realized that their brief encounter was just the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the flight attendants began serving the first-class meal service. Marcus politely thanked the attendant when she brought his meal and continued reading between bites. He had always been a quiet traveler, preferring to keep to himself and avoid unnecessary conversations with strangers. Victoria, however, seemed determined to make her displeasure known. She complained loudly about the temperature, the noise level, and the quality of the wine selection. Each complaint was delivered with theatrical sighs and pointed glances in Marcus's direction, as if his presence was somehow responsible for all the flight's shortcomings. "Excuse me?" Victoria called to the flight attendant, speaking loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "I specifically requested a window seat away from any disturbances. Is there any way I can be moved to a different section?" The flight attendant, a professional woman named Janet, who had been working for the airline for over 15 years, looked confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't see any disturbances. Is there a specific problem I can help you with?" Victoria's eyes darted toward Marcus, who was quietly eating his meal and reading his book. "Well, I just think there might be some passengers in first class who don't really belong here. Perhaps their tickets should be verified again?" Janet followed Victoria's gaze and immediately understood what was happening. She had witnessed this type of discrimination countless times during her career, and it always made her angry. However, she maintained her professional composure while addressing the situation. "Ma'am, all passengers in first class have been properly verified and have legitimate tickets. If you're uncomfortable for any reason, I can see if there are available seats in other sections of the aircraft." Marcus looked up from his book, having overheard the entire conversation. He made eye contact with Janet and gave her a small, appreciative nod. He had noticed how professionally she had handled Victoria's thinly veiled racism, and he was grateful for her discretion. Victoria realized that her complaints weren't getting the response she wanted. "Never mind," she said with obvious irritation. "I suppose I'll just have to endure it." The flight continued, and Victoria's behavior escalated. She made loud phone calls during the brief periods when electronic devices were allowed, discussing her terrible flight experience and how airlines were declining in quality. She spoke about feeling unsafe and uncomfortable with the questionable passengers in first class. Marcus tried to ignore her comments and focus on his book, but other passengers were beginning to notice Victoria's behavior. An elderly businessman sitting behind her looked disgusted by her obvious prejudice. A young woman traveling with her family shook her head in disapproval every time Victoria made another inflammatory comment. About halfway through the flight, Victoria stood up to use the restroom and accidentally bumped into Marcus's seat hard enough to jostle his drink. She offered a fake apology that dripped with sarcasm. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just not used to having to navigate around certain types of people in first class." Marcus looked up at her calmly and replied, "No problem at all, ma'am. Accidents happen." His gracious response only seemed to frustrate Victoria more. She had been trying to provoke a reaction that would justify her prejudice, but Marcus refused to give her what she wanted. His calm, dignified demeanor made her behavior appear even more unreasonable by contrast. Sarah, Victoria's traveling companion, was becoming increasingly embarrassed by her friend's actions. "Victoria, please stop," she whispered urgently. "You're making everyone uncomfortable, and frankly, you're embarrassing yourself." "I'm just standing up for standards," Victoria replied loudly. "Someone needs to say something about the decline in quality passengers. This used to be an exclusive cabin." An older woman sitting nearby finally spoke up. "The only person declining the quality of this cabin is you, dear. That gentleman has been nothing but polite and respectful, while you've been rude and disruptive since we took off." Victoria's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. She wasn't used to being called out for her behavior, especially not by other passengers. "I don't think you understand the situation," she began. But the older woman cut her off. "I understand. Perfectly well. I've been watching this entire display, and it's shameful. You should be ashamed of yourself." The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence as other passengers processed what had just happened. Victoria looked around and realized that most of the people in first class were looking at her with disapproval and disgust. She had expected support for her views, but instead found herself isolated and criticized. Marcus continued reading his book throughout the exchange, though he was quietly moved by the older woman's defense of him. He had learned not to expect strangers to speak up against prejudice, so when someone did, it always touched him deeply. Janet, the flight attendant, approached Marcus's seat during a quiet moment. "Sir, I want to apologize for any discomfort you've experienced during this flight. Your conduct has been exemplary, and I want you to know that the crew has taken note of the situation." "Thank you," Marcus replied quietly. "You've handled everything very professionally. I appreciate that." Victoria overheard this exchange and became even more agitated. She felt like everyone was conspiring against her, failing to understand that she was simply trying to maintain proper standards. In her mind, she was the victim of a misunderstanding, not the perpetrator of discrimination. As the flight began its descent, Victoria made one final attempt to assert her superiority. She called Janet over and demanded to speak with someone in authority about her poor flight experience. She insisted that her concerns about passenger screening and cabin security needed to be addressed immediately. Janet maintained her professional composure while explaining that all passenger concerns would be forwarded to the appropriate departments. However, she also made it clear that discriminatory behavior toward other passengers was not acceptable and could result in consequences for future travel. Victoria huffed and turned away, pulling out her phone to document her terrible treatment by the airline staff. She began typing furiously, preparing social media posts about her nightmare flight and the declining standards of the airline industry. Marcus quietly packed his book away as the plane prepared to land. He felt tired, not from the flight itself, but from dealing with the constant tension and hostility. These encounters always drained his energy, reminding him of how far society still had to go in terms of equality and basic human decency. As they approached the airport, Marcus looked out the window at the familiar skyline below. He was flying into his home city, where he had built his life and career. Soon he would be back in his own environment, surrounded by people who knew and respected him for who he truly was. Victoria, meanwhile, was still fuming about the flight and planning her complaints to the airline's customer service department. She had no idea that her actions during the flight had been observed and documented by multiple witnesses, including the professional flight crew. The plane touched down smoothly, and passengers began preparing to disembark. Marcus remained seated, in no hurry to leave, while Victoria gathered her expensive belongings and prepared to exit as quickly as possible. She wanted to put this awful experience behind her and never think about it again. Neither of them knew that their story was far from over, and that the consequences of Victoria's behavior were about to unfold in ways she never could have imagined. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and passengers began the familiar ritual of gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Victoria stood immediately, eager to escape what she considered the worst flight of her life. She pulled her designer carry-on from the overhead compartment with dramatic flair, making sure everyone around her knew she was displeased with her travel experience. Marcus remained seated, checking his phone for messages while other passengers filed out. He had received several texts from his assistant about meetings scheduled for the following day, including one that would require him to visit the airline's corporate headquarters. He smiled slightly at the irony, though he had no way of knowing just how significant that coincidence would prove to be. Victoria pushed past other passengers in her hurry to leave, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the aircraft floor. She muttered complaints under her breath about the unprofessional service and questionable passenger screening policies. Sarah followed behind her, looking embarrassed and trying to apologize to people for her friend's rude behavior. As they walked through the jet bridge, Victoria's phone buzzed with notifications. She had posted several social media updates during the flight about her horrible experience, and her followers were responding with a mixture of support and criticism. Some people agreed with her complaints about airline standards, while others called out her obvious prejudice and discrimination. Marcus finally stood and gathered his simple belongings. Janet, the flight attendant, approached him one more time before he left. "Mr. Thompson," she said quietly, "I want you to know that incidents like this are taken very seriously by our airline. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what happened during the flight?" Marcus paused, considering her request. He had dealt with discrimination throughout his life and usually chose not to pursue formal complaints, preferring to focus his energy on positive endeavors. However, something about this situation felt different. Victoria's behavior had been so blatant and public that it couldn't be ignored. "I appreciate your concern," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Let me think about it. Do you have a card I can contact you with?" Janet handed him her business card, along with a form for reporting passenger incidents. "There's no pressure, but if you decide to file a report, this information will help. What happened today wasn't acceptable, and you deserve better treatment." Marcus thanked her and made his way off the plane. As he walked through the terminal, he noticed Victoria ahead of him at the baggage claim area, still complaining loudly to Sarah about her flight experience. She was attracting attention from other travelers, most of whom looked annoyed by her dramatic behavior. "I'm definitely writing a formal complaint to the airline," Victoria announced to anyone within earshot. "This is exactly why I usually fly with other carriers. The quality control here is obviously lacking." Sarah tried to calm her friend down. "Victoria, maybe we should just go home and forget about this. You're making a scene and people are staring." "Good," Victoria replied defiantly. "Maybe if more people spoke up about these issues, airlines would maintain proper standards. I have every right to expect a certain quality of service when I pay for first class." Marcus collected his luggage from the carousel and headed toward the exit. He had a car waiting to take him home, where his wife and 2 children would be expecting him. Despite the unpleasant flight, he was looking forward to spending time with his family and putting the incident behind him. As he walked toward the pickup area, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed it was David Chen, the chief operating officer of Sky High Airlines and one of Marcus's closest friends and business partners. They had known each other for over 15 years, having met when Marcus was just beginning to build his business empire. "Marcus, how was your flight?" David asked as soon as Marcus answered the phone. "Interesting," Marcus replied with a dry chuckle. "I had quite an experience with a fellow first-class passenger, someone who had very strong opinions about who belongs in premium cabins." David's tone immediately became serious. "What happened? Please tell me this wasn't another discrimination incident." Marcus briefly explained the situation, describing Victoria's behavior and comments throughout the flight. David listened with growing concern and anger. As the COO of Sky High Airlines, he took issues of passenger discrimination very seriously, both from a moral standpoint and from a business perspective. "Marcus, this is unacceptable," David said firmly. "We've worked too hard to build an airline that treats all passengers with dignity and respect. Can you give me the flight details? I want to pull the passenger manifest and review any reports from the crew." "Flight 847 from Chicago to Atlanta," Marcus provided. "But David, I haven't decided if I want to make this into a big issue. You know how I feel about these situations." "I understand your usual approach," David replied. "But this happened on our airline, and we have a responsibility to address it. Even if you don't want to file a formal complaint, I need to know what happened so we can prevent it from occurring again." Meanwhile, Victoria was in the taxi line, still venting her frustrations to Sarah and to her Uber driver once they got in the car. She had decided to spend the entire ride to her luxury apartment building, composing her complaint letter to Sky High Airlines. She was convinced that her status as a frequent first-class passenger would give her complaint significant weight with the airline's management. "I'm going to demand compensation for this terrible experience," Victoria told Sarah as they sat in traffic. "I might even post a detailed review on social media. Companies need to understand that they can't treat valuable customers this way." Sarah had remained mostly quiet during Victoria's tirade, but she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with her friend's attitude. She had witnessed the entire incident on the plane and knew that Victoria's version of events was heavily skewed by her own prejudices. "Victoria," Sarah said carefully, "are you sure you want to make a big deal out of this? From my perspective, that man didn't do anything wrong. He was actually very polite and respectful throughout the entire flight." Victoria turned to stare at her friend in disbelief. "You're not seriously taking his side, are you? This is about maintaining standards and ensuring that first-class passengers get the experience they pay for." "But what exactly did he do wrong?" Sarah pressed. "He sat quietly, read his book, and was polite to everyone around him. You were the one making complaints and causing disruptions." Victoria's face flushed with anger. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered a close friend. "I can't believe you don't understand what this is really about. This is about safety, security, and maintaining the exclusivity that makes first class worth the extra cost. Sarah decided not to continue the argument, but she made a mental note to distance herself from Victoria's discriminatory attitudes in the future. She was beginning to realize that her friend's behavior reflected poorly on her own character, and she didn't want to be associated with such obvious prejudice. Back at his home, Marcus was enjoying dinner with his family. His wife, Jennifer, was a successful attorney, and his two children, aged 12 and 14, were both excellent students involved in various extracurricular activities. They lived in a beautiful suburban home, but Marcus had always insisted on maintaining a relatively modest lifestyle despite his wealth. "How was your trip, Dad?" his daughter asked as they sat around the dinner table. "Educational," Marcus replied with a wry smile. "I was reminded once again that people often make assumptions based on appearances." Jennifer, who had been married to Marcus for 16 years, immediately understood the implication. "What happened? Another incident?" Marcus briefly described the flight experience while his children listened with a mixture of anger and sadness. They had grown up aware of their father's success, but also understanding that racism and prejudice were still very real problems in society. "Dad, why don't you ever do anything about these situations?" his son asked. "You always just ignore it and move on." Marcus considered his son's question carefully. "I've always believed that the best response to ignorance is to succeed despite it, but you're right that sometimes silence can be interpreted as acceptance." As the family continued their dinner conversation, Marcus found himself thinking about Janet's request for a statement and David's concern about the incident. Perhaps it was time to take a different approach to discrimination, especially when it occurred in a context where he had the power to create meaningful change. Little did Victoria know that her complaint letter to Sky High Airlines was about to reach the desk of someone who had witnessed her behavior firsthand. The next morning, Victoria sat at her expensive glass desk in her luxury apartment, typing furiously on her laptop. She had spent hours crafting what she believed was a compelling complaint letter to Sky High Airlines. The letter detailed her horrific experience and demanded not only a full refund, but also changes to the airline's passenger screening policies. "Dear Sky High Airlines Management," her letter began, "I am writing to express my extreme dissatisfaction with Flight 847 from Chicago to Atlanta yesterday. As a frequent first-class passenger who spends thousands of dollars annually with your airline, I was appalled by the decline in passenger quality and service standards I experienced." Victoria went on to describe what she called security concerns and inappropriate passengers in first class, carefully wording her complaints to sound reasonable while making her discriminatory intent clear to anyone reading between the lines. She demanded immediate action and threatened to take her business elsewhere if her concerns weren't addressed promptly. After proofreading her letter multiple times, Victoria submitted it through the airline's official complaint portal. She felt satisfied with her work and confident that her status as a premium customer would guarantee a swift and favorable response. She had no idea that her complaint was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose her behavior to the very people she had discriminated against. Meanwhile, Marcus was in his downtown office, a modest space that reflected his practical approach to business. Despite being the owner of multiple successful companies, including a significant stake in Sky High Airlines, Marcus preferred to work in an environment that kept him connected to his employees and grounded in reality. His office walls were decorated with family photos and awards from various charitable organizations rather than expensive art or luxury items. His assistant, Rebecca, knocked on his office door around 10 a.m. "Mr. Thompson, David Chen from Sky High is here to see you. He said it's about yesterday's flight incident." Marcus looked up from the financial reports he was reviewing. "Send him in, please." David entered the office carrying a tablet and wearing a serious expression. He and Marcus had been friends for years, but their business relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values about treating people fairly and running ethical companies. Marcus, I pulled the crew reports from your flight yesterday, David began, settling into the chair across from Marcus's desk. Janet Williams, your flight attendant, filed a detailed incident report about a passenger making discriminatory comments and causing disruptions in first class. Marcus nodded. Janet was very professional throughout the entire situation. She handled it as well as anyone could have. There's more, David continued, swiping on his tablet. We received a formal complaint this morning from Victoria Ashford, the passenger who was harassing you. Her letter is interesting. David handed the tablet to Marcus, who read Victoria's complaint with growing amazement. Her version of events was so distorted and self-serving that it barely resembled what had actually happened on the flight. She portrayed herself as a victim of poor service and security concerns, while painting Marcus as some kind of threat to other passengers. This is incredible, Marcus said, shaking his head. She's managed to completely flip the narrative to make herself the victim. It gets worse, David replied. She's threatening to post negative reviews on social media and travel websites if we don't respond to her satisfaction. She's also demanding compensation and policy changes. Marcus read through the complaint again, paying particular attention to Victoria's demands. She wanted a full refund for her ticket, vouchers for future flights, and assurance that the airline would implement better screening procedures for first-class passengers. The discriminatory intent behind her requests was obvious to anyone, with experience recognizing such tactics. David, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, Marcus said, setting the tablet down. Usually I just let these incidents pass, but maybe it's time to take a different approach. This woman's behavior was so blatant and public that it can't be ignored. David leaned forward with interest. What do you have in mind? I want to respond to her complaint personally, Marcus said. Not as the anonymous customer service representative, but as the owner of the airline she's complaining to. I think it's time Ms. Ashford learned something about making assumptions based on appearances. David smiled for the first time since entering the office. I like where this is going. What's your plan? Marcus stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city skyline. I want you to schedule a meeting with Ms. Ashford. Tell her that senior management wants to discuss her complaint in person. Don't reveal my identity or role in the company. Let her think she's meeting with some middle management executive who will be intimidated by her threats and demands. And then? David asked, clearly enjoying the developing plan. Then I'll have a conversation with her about the importance of treating all passengers with dignity and respect, Marcus replied. Maybe she'll learn something about the consequences of prejudice and discrimination. David pulled out his phone and began checking Victoria's contact information from her complaint. I'll set up the meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Should I arrange for it to be recorded? This could be important documentation for our anti-discrimination policies. Marcus considered the suggestion. Yes, but make sure it's legal and that she's informed about the recording. I want this to be handled completely above board. While Marcus and David were planning their response, Victoria was at her office, telling her colleagues about her terrible flight experience and her complaint to the airline. She had embellished the story even further, portraying herself as a brave customer who stood up against declining service standards. I demanded to speak with senior management, Victoria told her co-workers during their lunch break. These airlines need to understand that paying customers have rights and expectations. I'm not going to accept substandard service just because companies are afraid to maintain proper standards. Her colleague, James, listened to Victoria's story with growing skepticism. He had known Victoria for several years and was familiar with her tendency to exaggerate situations and play the victim when her own behavior was questionable. Victoria, James said carefully, are you sure you're telling this story objectively? It sounds like maybe there were some misunderstandings that got blown out of proportion. Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. Are you questioning my version of events? I know what I experienced, and I know discrimination when I see it. The problem is that too many people are afraid to speak up about these issues. James decided not to push the conversation further, but he made a mental note to be more careful. about his association with Victoria's controversial opinions. He was beginning to realize that her definition of discrimination might be very different from the actual meaning of the word. That afternoon, Victoria received a phone call from Sky High Airlines customer service. The representative, who was actually David Chen, though Victoria didn't know it, informed her that senior management had reviewed her complaint and wanted to meet with her in person to discuss her concerns. "We take all passenger feedback very seriously," David said in his most professional voice, "and we want to ensure that your experience with our airline improves in the future. Would you be available to meet with our senior management team tomorrow afternoon?" Victoria was thrilled. This was exactly the response she had hoped for when she submitted her complaint. She interpreted the meeting request as validation of her concerns and proof that her status as a premium customer carried significant weight with the airline. "Of course I'm available," Victoria replied eagerly. "I'm glad to see that Sky High Airlines takes customer service seriously. I have several suggestions for policy improvements that I'd be happy to discuss." David scheduled the meeting for 2 p.m. the following day at the airline's corporate headquarters. He gave Victoria directions to the executive conference room and assured her that senior management was very interested in hearing her perspective on the incident. After ending the call, Victoria immediately called Sarah to share the good news. "They want to meet with me tomorrow," she announced proudly. "Senior management is taking my complaint seriously and wants to discuss policy changes. I told you that speaking up about these issues would make a difference." Sarah listened to Victoria's excitement with growing unease. She had a bad feeling about the situation, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Something about Victoria's version of events didn't sit right with her, and she was beginning to worry that her friend might be walking into a situation she wasn't prepared for. "Victoria, are you sure you want to pursue this?" Sarah asked. "Maybe it would be better to just accept whatever compensation they offer and move on." "Absolutely not," Victoria replied firmly. "This is bigger than just my individual experience. This is about maintaining standards and ensuring that airlines provide the service that premium passengers deserve. I have a responsibility to speak up." As Victoria prepared for her meeting with airline management, she had no idea that she was about to come face-to-face with the very person she had discriminated against on the flight. Her assumptions about Marcus's identity and status were about to be shattered in the most dramatic way possible. Victoria spent the entire morning preparing for her meeting with Sky High Airlines management. She selected her most expensive business suit, a sharp charcoal gray ensemble that she believed projected authority and success. She practiced her presentation in front of her bathroom mirror, rehearsing the key points she wanted to make about passenger screening and service standards. She arrived at the Sky High Airlines corporate headquarters 30 minutes early, wanting to make a strong impression on the executives she would be meeting. The building was impressive, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that spoke to the airline's success and prominence in the industry. Victoria felt validated by the professional environment, confident that serious business people would understand and appreciate her concerns. The receptionist directed Victoria to the 20th floor, where the executive offices were located. As she rode the elevator up, Victoria reviewed her talking points one more time. She was determined to present herself as a reasonable, high-value customer whose feedback deserved serious consideration and immediate action. David Chen met Victoria in the lobby of the executive floor, introducing himself as the Senior Customer Relations Manager, a deliberately vague title that didn't reveal his actual position as Chief Operating Officer. He was professionally dressed and maintained a neutral expression as he escorted Victoria to the conference room. "Thank you for coming in today, Ms. Ashford," David said as they walked down the hallway. "We appreciate customers who take the time to provide detailed feedback about their experiences with our airline." Victoria beamed with satisfaction. "I believe that premium customers have a responsibility to speak up when standards decline. I'm glad to see that Sky High Airlines values that kind of input." The conference room was elegant, but not ostentatious, with a large oval table and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. David gestured for Victoria to take a seat and offered her water or coffee, which she declined. She was too excited about the meeting to think about refreshments. "Before we begin," David said, "I want to let you know that this meeting is being recorded for quality assurance and training purposes. Is that acceptable to you?" Victoria nodded eagerly. "Of course. I want there to be a clear record of this conversation." David activated the recording system and settled into his chair. "Now, I understand you had some concerns about your recent flight experience. Could you walk me through what happened from your perspective?" Victoria launched into her prepared presentation, describing what she characterized as a security incident and inappropriate passenger behavior in first class. She carefully avoided explicitly mentioning race, instead using coded language about passenger screening and maintaining standards that she believed would resonate with airline executives. As Victoria spoke, David took notes and maintained a neutral expression, occasionally asking clarifying questions. He wanted to give her enough rope to hang herself, so to speak, by allowing her to fully express her discriminatory views before revealing the truth about the situation. "So you felt that this passenger didn't belong in first class?" David asked carefully. "What specifically made you feel that way?" Victoria hesitated for a moment, realizing she needed to be careful about how she phrased her response. "Well, it was obvious from his appearance and behavior that he wasn't accustomed to premium travel accommodations. His clothing was very casual, and he just didn't seem to fit the typical first-class passenger profile." "I see," David replied, making more notes. "And what actions did you take based on these observations?" Victoria straightened in her chair, clearly proud of what she perceived as her assertive behavior. "I politely questioned whether he had the correct ticket when I saw him in the first-class boarding line. I was just trying to help prevent any confusion or embarrassment." David nodded slowly. "And how did this passenger respond to your assistance?" "He was somewhat defensive," Victoria replied, conveniently omitting the fact that Marcus had been completely polite and had simply shown his valid boarding pass. "I think he realized that I had noticed he didn't really belong there." "Ms. Ashford," David said, setting down his pen, "before we continue, I'd like to bring in another member of our senior management team who has been following your case closely. Would that be acceptable?" Victoria's eyes lit up with excitement. This was even better than she had hoped. Multiple senior executives were taking her complaint seriously. "Of course! I'm happy to discuss this with anyone who has the authority to implement the changes I'm suggesting." David stepped out of the conference room briefly, leaving Victoria alone to savor her anticipated victory. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a text message to Sarah. "Meeting going perfectly. Multiple executives want to hear my suggestions. This is exactly what I hoped would happen." A few moments later, David returned to the conference room, followed by a man in a well-tailored business suit. Victoria looked up expectantly, ready to greet another airline executive who would validate her concerns and implement her suggested policy changes. Her expression froze as she recognized the face of the man entering the room. It was Marcus Thompson, the same person she had harassed and discriminated against on the flight just 2 days earlier. But now he was dressed in an expensive suit, carried himself with obvious authority, and was clearly someone important within the airline's management structure. "Ms. Ashford," David said formally, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Thompson, the chairman and CEO of Sky High Airlines." Victoria's face went pale as the full implications of the situation hit her. The man she had assumed was some kind of inferior passenger who didn't belong in first class was actually the owner of the entire airline. Every assumption she had made, every discriminatory comment she had voiced, every demand for better passenger screening had been directed at the very person who had the ultimate authority over airline policies. Marcus took a seat across from Victoria at the conference table, maintaining the same calm, dignified demeanor he had displayed throughout their flight. "Ms. Ashford, thank you for coming in today. I understand you had some concerns about your recent travel experience with us." Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times as she struggled to find words. Her carefully prepared presentation had evaporated from her mind, replaced by the horrifying realization that she had completely misjudged the situation. The man she had treated with such disrespect and prejudice was not only a fellow passenger, but the most powerful person in the entire company. I didn't realize, Victoria stammered, her usual confidence completely shattered. You didn't realize what? Exactly? Marcus asked gently. That appearances can be deceiving? That successful people don't always dress to display their wealth? Or that the person you were discriminating against might actually be someone with the power to address your complaints? Victoria's hands were shaking as she tried to process what was happening. Her entire worldview, built around assumptions about class, race, and status, was crumbling before her eyes. The man she had dismissed as unworthy of first-class accommodations was not only wealthy enough to afford premium travel but owned the entire airline. Mr. Thompson, Victoria began weakly, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. Marcus held up a hand to stop her. Ms. Ashford, I was sitting directly across from you during that entire flight. I heard every comment you made about my appearance, my worthiness to be in first class, and your concerns about passenger screening. There was no misunderstanding about your behavior or your intentions. David pulled out his tablet and began reading from the flight crew reports. According to our flight attendant's detailed account, you questioned Mr. Thompson's right to be in first class, made multiple discriminatory comments about his appearance and background, deliberately bumped into his seat, and created a disruptive environment for other passengers. Victoria realized that her complaint letter, which she had thought would bring swift resolution in her favor, had instead triggered an investigation that exposed her own discriminatory behavior. Every word she had written, every demand she had made, now seemed foolish and embarrassing in light of Marcus's true identity. I want you to understand something, Ms. Ashford, Marcus continued, his voice remaining calm but firm. Sky High Airlines was built on the principle that all passengers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance, background, or any other personal characteristics. Your behavior on that flight violated everything this company stands for. Victoria felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the full weight of her situation became clear. She had not only embarrassed herself publicly, but had also potentially damaged her reputation and future travel options with a major airline. Her assumptions about Marcus had been completely wrong, and her discriminatory behavior had been documented and witnessed by multiple people. Please, Victoria whispered, I never meant for things to go this far. I was just trying to maintain standards. Marcus leaned forward slightly. Ms. Ashford, the only standard that was compromised on that flight was the standard of basic human decency. You treated me poorly not because of anything I did or said, but because of assumptions you made based on my appearance and race. The recording device continued to capture every word of the conversation, creating a permanent record of Victoria's discriminatory behavior and its consequences. Her complaint letter, which she had intended as a weapon against perceived injustice, had instead become evidence of her own prejudice and poor judgment. The conference room fell into a heavy silence as Victoria struggled to comprehend the magnitude of her situation. Marcus Thompson, the man she had treated with such contempt and prejudice, sat across from her as the owner and CEO of the very company she had demanded make changes to accommodate her discriminatory preferences. Mr. Thompson, Victoria finally managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I sincerely apologize for my behavior. I had no idea who you were, and I realize now that I made terrible assumptions. Marcus studied her for a moment before responding. Ms. Ashford, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you treated me poorly because of assumptions you made about who I was. Would your behavior have been acceptable if I had been any other passenger? Victoria's face crumpled as she realized the truth in his words. Her apology had revealed that she was only sorry because she had misjudged Marcus's status and power, not because she understood that her discriminatory behavior was wrong regardless of whom she targeted. "Let me ask you a question," Marcus continued. "If I had been a teacher, a construction worker, or an unemployed person, would your treatment of me have been justified? Do you believe that some people deserve respect only if they meet your standards of wealth or status?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but found herself unable to form a coherent answer. She was beginning to understand that her entire value system was flawed and that her behavior reflected deep-seated prejudices that she had never properly examined. David Chen cleared his throat and consulted his notes. "Ms. Ashford, in your complaint letter, you demanded a full refund, travel vouchers, and changes to our passenger screening policies. You also threatened to post negative reviews and take your business elsewhere. Given what we now know about the situation, how do you think we should respond to those demands?" Victoria's shoulders sagged with defeat. Her complaint letter, which had seemed so righteous and justified when she wrote it, now appeared petty and discriminatory. She realized that she had no leverage in this situation, and that her threats to damage the airline's reputation would likely backfire on her own professional standing. "I withdraw my complaint," Victoria said quietly. "I understand. Now that I was completely wrong about what happened on that flight." Marcus nodded, but wasn't finished with the conversation. "Ms. Ashford, this incident has given me an opportunity to reflect on how our airline handles discrimination. We're going to use this as a learning experience, not just for you, but for our entire organization." He turned to David. "I want you to develop a comprehensive anti-discrimination training program for all our employees. I also want to create a clear policy for handling passengers who engage in discriminatory behavior toward other travelers." David made notes as Marcus continued. "We're going to make it clear that Sky High Airlines has zero tolerance for prejudice and discrimination in any form. Passengers who engage in such behavior will face consequences, including potential banning from future flights." Victoria realized that her actions were going to have lasting implications beyond her own embarrassment. Her behavior had prompted policy changes that would affect how the airline handled similar situations in the future. "Mr. Thompson," Victoria said hesitantly, "what does this mean for me? Am I banned from flying with Sky High Airlines?" Marcus considered her question carefully. "Ms. Ashford, I believe in the possibility of redemption and learning from mistakes. However, your behavior on that flight was completely unacceptable and created a hostile environment for other passengers." He paused before continuing. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can accept a temporary suspension from flying with our airline while you complete a diversity and sensitivity training program, or you can choose to take your business elsewhere permanently." Victoria was stunned by the offer. She had expected to be banned outright from the airline, but Marcus was giving her an opportunity to make amends for her behavior. "What would the training program involve?" she asked. "You would work with a professional diversity consultant to examine your biases and learn about the impact of discrimination," Marcus explained. "You would also be required to write a formal apology letter that acknowledges the harm your behavior caused and demonstrates genuine understanding of why it was wrong." Victoria nodded slowly. The training program would be humiliating, but it was better than being permanently banned from a major airline. More importantly, she was beginning to realize that she genuinely needed to examine her attitudes and behaviors. "I accept the training program," Victoria said. "I want to learn from this experience and become a better person." Marcus stood up from the table, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "Ms. Ashford, I hope you understand that this isn't just about airline policies or customer service. This is about basic human dignity and respect. Every person deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived status." As Victoria prepared to leave the conference room, she felt overwhelmed by shame and regret. Her assumptions about Marcus had been completely wrong, and her discriminatory behavior had been exposed in the most dramatic way possible. She realized that she had a lot of work to do to examine her biases and change her attitudes. David escorted Victoria to the elevator, providing her with information about the diversity training program and the steps she would need to complete before being allowed to fly with Sky High Airlines again. As the elevator doors closed, Victoria caught a glimpse of her reflection and barely recognized the humbled, chastened person staring back at her. Back in the conference room, Marcus and David debriefed about the meeting. "Do you think she'll actually learn from this experience?" David asked. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know, but we've given her the opportunity. Some people are capable of genuine change when confronted with the consequences of their actions. Others just become better at hiding their prejudices." "What about the policy changes you mentioned?" David inquired. "I'm serious about those," Marcus replied. "This incident has shown me that we need clearer procedures for handling discrimination between passengers. We also need to make sure our crew members are trained to intervene appropriately when they witness such behavior." Over the following weeks, news of the incident began to spread through social media and travel industry publications. Someone had recorded video of Victoria's behavior on the flight, and the footage went viral when combined with the story of her meeting with Marcus. The incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions based on appearance and the importance of treating all people with respect. Victoria completed her diversity training program over the next few months. The process was difficult and often uncomfortable, as she was forced to confront her own biases and examine the harm her attitudes had caused to others. She wrote multiple drafts of her apology letter before producing one that demonstrated genuine understanding and remorse. When Victoria was finally cleared to fly with Sky High Airlines again, she was a changed person. She had learned valuable lessons about prejudice, privilege, and the importance of treating all people with dignity. Her first flight back was a humbling experience, as she made a conscious effort to be respectful and kind to every person she encountered. Marcus continued to use the incident as a teaching moment within his company and in his public speaking engagements. He often told the story of Flight 847 as an example of how discrimination can affect anyone, regardless of their actual status or position in society. The incident reinforced his commitment to building a company culture based on respect and equality. The story of Victoria and Marcus became a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving and that everyone deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. It showed that discrimination not only harms its targets, but also reveals the character flaws and moral failings of those who engage in such behavior. Most importantly, the incident demonstrated that people in positions of power have a responsibility to stand up against discrimination and create environments where all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully. Marcus's response to Victoria's behavior set a standard for how leaders should address prejudice and work to create more inclusive communities. The woman who had mocked a black man on a plane had indeed found out that he owned the airline, but, more significantly, she had learned that her assumptions about people based on their appearance were not only wrong, but also morally indefensible. The experience changed both of their lives in ways they never could have imagined when they first boarded Flight 847.